on accessibility and systemic ableism. I'm your webinar host, Dr. Lucy Kotsum. I'd like to note that this webinar is being recorded. So just a quick note about me. I'm a member of the MSSU Capacity Building Committee, as well as an associate professor in industrial organizational psychology at St. Mary's University in Halifax. I teach, research, advocate for equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. I myself am a disabled scholar, and my pronouns are she, they. I have the immense privilege to introduce our panel today. But before I do, I'd like to acknowledge that we are all joining this webinar from Turtle Island. I invite each of you to reflect on where you are on the land and on your relationship to it as Indigenous, as descendant of settlers, or a more recent settler. A reminder that our unresolved history is our present responsibility, and to hold space for a multiplicity of narratives and the tensions that may arise in doing so. Our webinar is a 1-hour panel discussion, followed by 30 minutes of Q&A from the audience. We ask that you keep comments and questions that arise for the Q&A session. Please reach out to Prince for any technical issues. Our session is live captioned, which can be turned on. We also have ASL interpreters with us, who are identified as ASL English interpreters A and B. Their screens have a green background. Their screens will always be engaged, and they work in 15 to 20-minute shifts. As chair, my role is to keep the discussion moving, to ensure that each panelist has equal opportunity to communicate, and that each planned question is given about equal time. Our panelists: Miriam Schroeder, who identifies as gender fluid, self-identifies as Black Nova Scotian, trans, queer, disabled, neurodiverse, medical immigrant, CF Canada public speaker, poet, activist, academic scholar, with research focus on cystic fibrosis and representation. Trudy Flynn is a patient partner, MSSU EDIA science team member, MSSU Scientific Leadership Committee member, and MSSU Patient Partner Council member. Patient engagement researcher are they, them. Member of the National Educational Association of Disabled Students, or NEEDS, or board chair, sorry, and New Brunswick director and co-chair of the Graduate Studies Committee, and advocate, community advocate-based educator. We are also joined by EDIA science leads who have led the coordination of today's session. Prince Owusu, whose pronouns are he, him, his, MSSU EDI science trainee and PhD candidate at Carleton University School of Social Work, as well as Dr. Katie Aubrecht, whose pronouns are she, her, MSSU EDIA science lead, who self-identifies as disabled, associate professor in the Department of Sociology, Canada Research Chair in Health Equity and Social Justice, Director of the Spatializing Care Intersectional Disability Studies Lab at St. FX, and member of the CIHR External Advisory Committee on Accessibility and Anti-Ableism. Katie and Prince will now share a few words on the EDIA team and the goal of the session.
Thank you so much, Lucy, and thanks to all of the panelists and everyone for joining us here today. Thanks also to the ASL interpreters for helping to support the accessibility of the session. So the MSSU EDIA science team is one of the cross-cutting themes at MSSU We work alongside our comrades and colleagues in the Indigenous Allyship and Engagement team and Sex and Gender-Based Analysis team to strengthen EDIA in the maritime health research community. And so we do this through developing and pursuing a number of strategic goals, which really focus on building relationships across the maritime health research landscape, setting goals for EDIA in partnership and collaboration with others within and across MSSU and with affiliates and stakeholders and decision makers, and most importantly, the patient partners and publics and communities, which are really at the heart of everything that we do at the MSSU. The goal of this webinar is to contribute to that work. Something that's very important to us is implementing and supporting EDIA initiatives and measuring our progress. And as part of that, we wanted to start the conversation on accessibility, what that A means in EDIA, and the importance of being aware of and understanding how to address and support accessibility and systemic ableism within health and health research.
And Prince, did you have a few words to share?
Yes. Hi, everybody. It's such a great pleasure to be part of the team delivering this webinar. A lot of thought went into planning this webinar and actually delivering it. And the emphasis on systemic ableism and accessibility is really essential. And really, when we think about EDIA, accessibility often gets lost in the mix. So today we are intentional about centering accessibility in our webinar to create a decisive path forward, to help engage with this pertinent aspect of equity that's usually lost in the mix. As we learn today, you'll hear first voice accounts from experts in the field who have really engaged with the subject, from allies of the disabled community, and also from our patient partners. We gave pertinent consideration to first voice accounts because it is really essential in any approach towards EDIA. We need to recognize who is at the table, whose voice is being engaged, and the ensuing power dynamics at play. Today, we offer a safe space for engagement and learning, and we recognize that equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility is a process. So our focus is on building relationships and discovering next steps together as we strive to reduce barriers and live more equitably. As we move forward, please feel free to engage with the panel as there will be a time set aside for questions. Lucy?
Thanks so much, Prince. So this webinar is focused on accessibility and systemic ableism. And we thought it would be helpful to briefly describe some concepts and terms that will likely be used throughout the webinar, or concepts that you might have been wondering about. So first, EDIA itself, just briefly, and note that these definitions are not comprehensive, but they're just brief, so that we can have them as touch points. So equity, briefly defined as access, resources, and opportunities provided to everyone to support their growth and success. Diversity, differences in race, color, place of origin, religion, family status, immigrant and newcomer status, ethnic origin, ability, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and age. Inclusion. This can be understood as both a practice and an experience. So something we do to make an environment inclusive, and something we feel. We feel an environment as inclusive. So it's both a practice and experience of all individuals being and feeling valued and respected for their contributions, being and feeling supported to succeed, being and feeling safe to express honest opinions. It's also having your voice incorporated into decision-making and feeling like your voice matters to decision-making. And it can be simply belonging or feeling like you belong in the space. Accessibility, very briefly, availability, and approachability of people, structures, and resources. These can be physical, environmental, and psychological. I also want to briefly touch on terms that are really important. MAD, deaf with a capital D, and neurodivergent. So MAD, mixed anxiety and depression, deaf with a capital D, denoting folks in the deaf community, and neurodivergent. These terms are terms people and groups and communities are using to self-describe, which reference cultural communities in which there's a shared experience. And in the case of the deaf community, a shared or common language. So we will open our panel discussion now. And we have 4 questions prepared for our panelists. And I will open the questions. So question 1, for the first question, I'm going to invite the panel to consider ableism, systemic ableism, and anti-ableism. Please share with us, what do ableism, systemic ableism, and anti-ableism mean to you in your work, your lived experience, and in the broader Canadian historical and health research context? Miriam, let's start with you.
So I guess to start out, just to sort of how do we engage with systemic ableism, I think it's good to think about sort of intersectionality and how that can give us a bit of a toolkit, I'd say, in terms of trying to find ways to gain equitable access to resources and processes and policies, etc. So intersectionality is basically just this idea that there are multiple layers of oppression and privilege socially in our societies that have to do a lot with power relations and who gets access to care and who doesn't. And it's very steeped in anti-disability thinking, and it can have a very strong colonial and capitalistic narrative to it. And it's it actually directly relates into a very really specific social justice movement called disability justice, which is steeped in intersectional thinking, and it has about 10 principles that kind of give even more tools to engage against this idea of systemic ableism. And it's a movement that really kind of not just talks about how do we gain access, but how do we gain it on a much more deeper level. It gives you a chance to unpack things that is not just surface level kind of change. It goes deeper into policies, it goes into histories, it goes into areas all over society that you can basically kind of start from the ground up and include everyone who wasn't there, I guess, from the very beginning, and work something brand new that makes and reflects more equitable, a more equitable care model. Which is really interesting because I guess for the work that I do with cystic fibrosis, I basically utilized, I guess, lived experience, and I turned that into, I guess, a methodological framework of autoethnography. And then I use these theories of intersectional thinking and this disability justice lens to really start unpacking this illness and what can be compounding on patients who have this disease, but so much more going on top of that. And really, you know, as some people say, like, we do not lead single issue lives. Like, it is not just one problem that many of us have to deal with. And I think just in terms of kind of a really cool way to look at it is kind of like now moving forward, if you look at things and you want to tackle the systemic ableism on all kinds of levels, you kind of have to think almost like in a, like beside you, you want your allies. On the other side, you want your community. Behind you, you want your ancestors who maybe had never had a chance to speak and think about the historical context involved, and then look forward and how do we now, moving forward, make systems that allow everything to be considered. And I think that's really important.
Trudy or Maggie, what thoughts do you have to share about ableism? Perhaps lived experience. What does it look like? What does an ableist, experience look like? What might be some examples of systemic ableism? Perhaps.
I'll speak to that. I'll speak to
Yeah.
that. I find that ableism to me is the assumption that everyone can be accommodated just by using the system that they're used to using. They don't take into account that not everyone can do what they expect you to do. So I actually found that COVID has served my community quite well by having things turn virtual, because lots of meetings I'm not able to attend because in person, because of my illness and because of the situation that that meeting is being, or the conditions that meeting's being held under. And I find since COVID restrictions have been loosened that that's returning. So I have meetings where people expect me to go in person, and I'm immune compromised, so I'm still wearing a mask, and I'm still not going to meetings where people aren't wearing masks, and so I'm excluded, or I'm put on, okay, well, we'll have Zoom just for you, but then you're in the background and you're not able to really speak when you're at those meetings. And so to me, people don't recognize, first of all, what ableism is. They don't even understand that that's what they're being. They don't understand how harmful that is to the disabled community, no matter what your disability is. I'll give an example of my son-in-law developed cancer last year, and he was in very bad shape at Christmas time. And so we were going to look at the lights on the Halifax waterfront, and we took him in a wheelchair. And I, as a person who stands upright and can walk, I couldn't believe how difficult it was to wheel him around the city of Halifax, how many barriers there were. When all of a sudden you're on a sidewalk and they're doing construction and they say, oh, you can't, you have to shift sides, but there's nowhere that you can push a wheelchair down over the curb. I couldn't, it was a very eye-opening experience for that type of disability. So I think that there's so many things that have to be looked at to combat ableism in our healthcare system, in our health research, and just in our communities in general, that I think it's a huge issue, and I think the disabled community has a huge job ahead of them.
Thanks, Trudy. And Maggie, did you have, what were your thoughts?
Just real quickly from a lived experience perspective. I was born as a person with a disability, raised by two people with acquired disabilities. My mom lost her vision to malpractice when I was 4. My dad had the side of his head tore off in a sawmill when I was 3. And us navigating the medical system as a family was typically quite a nightmare. And we had to reach out to, well, they had to reach out to community groups to figure out how to make navigation work back in the early 90s. And the best solution for when my dad wasn't available to my mom was to train up an 8-year-old to do sighted guide. And it's those kind of experiences that have led me down the path where I am today, because there is still so much more to be done. But also that kind of identity of my family led to my disability not actually having a medicalized label, as it were, until I was in my early 20s. And a peculiar situation, but I also came to reconcile that labels weren't all that important. But where I can best lend my knowledge right now today is on the educational perspective of the medicalization. So ableism, because of medicalization of disability and ableism, what that means for a person with a disability getting access to education, which isn't related directly to healthcare. If you don't have those documentations, the letter from the doctor, the et cetera, you can't get very far in education, or you can get so far, but you'll be met with barrier upon barrier. And that's still a coast-to-coast issue across Canada today, affecting thousands of post-secondary students with disabilities. And as of just this past Friday, I met with a graduate student in crisis over medicalized definition of disability. So it's definitely an ongoing issue. I'll leave it at that.
Well, I thank you so much, Maggie. I was going to actually ask for folks who might not be as familiar with that, if, and I'll open it up just generally to the panel, to you as well, Maggie, just to talk a little bit about what you mean by medicalization and any alternative definitions of disability. So how the medicalization of disability itself is a barrier. Just to talk about that a little bit more for folks who might not be aware, because so in education and in workplaces also, in terms of getting right now accommodation, often will require a medical attestation of disability. So do other folks have reflections on that and a different way of looking at disability, perhaps?
Find in my experience that because my disability is not visible, I get treated very differently than people that I know who have visible disabilities, or also I tend to have, even from my own doctor who diagnosed me, I still find that she can't see past the "but you don't look sick." And so I find that that type of thing is yeah, in the healthcare system, I find that if you don't look sick, or if you don't have a physical, something they can actually see, then I find that really affects the care that you receive.
Miriam, did you have any reflections on that?
Yeah, so as someone who identifies as having CF and being neurodiverse, having a diagnosed learning disability, yeah, I think that absolutely. I think that, yeah, disability is certainly a loaded political term. It's certainly, everyone has a different, I would say, unique experience of disability. And I think that this idea, in which I was going to eventually have a chat about in terms of gatekeeping, is this issue that I apologize, there's construction going on. No, but this idea that for certain people, that if they don't see us as a certain rubric of disability, then that we in the long term are the ones who suffer. And that's a huge, huge problem still. And I think that That's the policy that I'd like to also have an impact on eventually, is to say, look, like we have a lot going on, and in my work, I'm always stressing the compounding pressures, right? So I mean, you're all day long, you have, you can't breathe, and you're feeling, you've got racism on one end, you've got transphobia, homophobia, you've got xenophobia, you've got masking happening because maybe you're severe LD and you have to constantly have that almost like a PR mask on all day to pretend that you're neurotypical, that kind of stuff. So it's really, really hard. And I think that these are the kind of events too that need to be done so much more too now in our day and age, because there's so many people that haven't had a chance to lend their lens, you know what I mean? Like, it's so important, I think, to be able to say, like, just
Your internet stalled on us, Miriam. Just the last bit of what you said, perhaps to repeat.
yeah, sure. No, I'm just saying that it's important to allow all of us now to have these unique, very unique lenses, because everyone has a different experience of these compounding effects. And I think that because of that diversity and that actual inclusiveness,
Okay, we're having a few audio issues with Miriam.
and I think people need to be made aware of that.
Okay. Thanks, Miriam. I think I'll proceed to the next question, but I wanted to reflect just a little bit. I really the very important and just the aspects that resonated with me in terms of systemic ableism. I appreciated Trudy's comment that not everyone can be accommodated by the system as it exists. So, and at that nexus, well, we have to change the system, and we as individuals can observe in our own work, oh, wait, the system isn't quite working for this scenario. What is it about the system? What barrier exists in the system that can that needs to be lifted, or a different way of doing business, a different way of ensuring, providing services that take into account the lived experience of people with disabilities. So I'll segue to the next question. And the next question pertains to improving accessibility in the Maritime SPORE Support Unit strategic areas and goals. So the MSSU work is focused on 5 strategic areas designed to support research that improves Maritimers' access to high quality and cost-effective healthcare. And these 5 areas: data platforms and services, learning health systems, capacity development, patient engagement, and effective collaboration within and across the Maritime provinces. So as an organization funded by CHR, MSSU is required itself to be accessible, and also to support research that improves accessibility in each of these areas. So my question, and it's open to all the panelists, so think about who might want to start. How can MSSU staff help MSSU meet its accessibility mandate? Now, you can choose, one area, say a little bit about each area, but again, data platforms and services, learning health systems, capacity development, patient engagement, and effective collaboration within and across the Maritime provinces. Who might like to start?
I can start.
Trudy.
I would like to say that I think the first thing that needs to happen is that all these areas reflect on and make sure they understand what ableism is and how that can affect their area of expertise. And when they include patient partners in those areas, even something like data systems, you have to have the right person with that you're dealing with, so that you're getting the full benefit of what a patient partner can give to each of these areas. But even with patient partners who have illnesses that may not be as disabling as others, and sometimes someone had an illness and they've recovered from it, so they aren't classified in the disabled community. But even then, they have to make things accessible for them. And they have to make sure that everyone understands where they are, what page they're on, and the language they use. Because sometimes you promote ableism just by the language you use, and you make things inaccessible to people and patient partners especially that could have valuable contributions, but they don't understand the language you're using, and they don't understand exactly how they can communicate with the people or how they can contribute. So I think really recognizing what ableism is and making sure you're not practicing ableistic tendencies or methods in your area of expertise.
Trudy, I wanted to follow up. You said that it's important to include the right patient partner for that particular, to provide their to provide their advice. What do you mean by that?
Well, sometimes patient partners are overused. If there's only a few patient partners, or if you've worked with a previous patient partner, you may like working with them, and so you tend to try to include them into everything you do. And I mean, that's okay if that person has the expertise in that area, but sometimes they're invited just to fill a gap and make sure that there is a patient partner on that team. And it may not be a person who's interested in data platforms or know anything about them or learning health systems. So you need to make sure that the patient partner you're engaging is actually wants to be there, has knowledge to be there, has the experience to be there. Because just having them there for the sake of saying, well, I've checked that box, I have patient partners, doesn't contribute to getting rid of ableism. That's a type of ableism in itself, actually, because you're not looking at, does this person, is this person able to contribute the way they should be contributing?
Okay. Also, you had mentioned that language used can be ableist, and I wanted to ask you or other panelists, do you have examples? What might be some examples of that?
Well, the use of acronyms is an obvious one, actually, when patient partners are involved, and it makes patient partners feel like they need a degree in research in order to participate. We have some patient partners who can contribute greatly, but they may not have finished high school. They may have certainly not been in a medical or research field, and they feel that they can't contribute if they don't understand what's being asked of them or what's being spoken at these meetings. And so I think you could lose some valuable patient partners by not realizing that it has to be accessible, that your team has to be accessible to people who don't have the knowledge that the leader does, or that the scientific team does. And if they want that valuable contribution of patient partners, then they need to talk at that level.
So perhaps a certain level of training, or now I'm being an industrial organizational psychologist or workplace psychologist, thinking about onboarding, right? What materials can be provided to help as a knowledge exchange, to help the person either learn learn these terms, or perhaps not use so many jargon terms in engaging in these discussions in the first place. Other folks, Miriam or Maggie, reflecting on that, or the question itself. So in terms of what staff can do, how staff can help MSSU meet its accessibility mandate in these areas.
Yeah, actually, that's a really good point that Trudy brings up, because to be honest, it actually goes right back to this colonial thinking of institutional higher up. It's so colonial because oh, sorry, my connection. Okay.
Yeah, your connection, just as you were starting to answer the question. Yeah.
So what I'm saying is that, yeah, I felt very kind of almost like the only option I had at the time to talk about these things that I kept seeing growing up, and it's kind of twofold. Like for me, it's like I found a way to articulate a bit better what some of the problems were that I lived experience. Autoethnography, like that was a huge battle for me in WGST, in debates about people saying, well, that's not really, academic scholarship. And I thought, wow, like you're going to leave out a lot of people in the end who have incredible, not just incredible, but there's trauma there. There's all kinds of things that has happened to people that once it's been made into scholarship and or written about or brought to the forefront, that other people can feel comfort in and solidarity, and understand that they're not the only ones that are struggling with this, that there's some sense of community out there that can also help them and let them know that it's not their own struggle, their own fight. So yeah, I found that it's kind of twofold. In some ways, I felt kind of like it was one of the only few places where I felt I could take the stuff I've gone through and make it more coherent and what happens and happened. And yet, as I was engaging in it, it kept going back to, but I want to decolonize the process, because it is part of that problem, right? That is literally part of what so many profs are doing, decolonizing syllabuses, etc. And if profs are doing it in the academy, then we should be thinking about that too in employment, etc., etc., etc. Because we should be thinking about ways to decolonize this idea that only a certain level, higher level thinking will let you speak to a certain subject. And that's exactly what I heard from Trudy, where it's like, okay, you need to have integrity in the work, because if you're going to keep going back to the same individuals over and over to fill that gap, to say that it's been taken care of, it's not been taken care of, and you are indeed actually engaging in the very thing that you're supposed to be helping dismantle. So, yeah.
Okay. And in that way, engaging a patient simply because they're a patient. Another term used oftentimes is tokenism. So you're checking that one identity for that person, but not being inclusive of not just all the other aspects that they offer, but all the other aspects that are needed in that particular patient engaged role. Maggie, do you have reflections to share in terms of what MSSU staff, what they can do?
One big blanket issue that kind of hits all these parts is any print documentation, any e-files, anything actually needs to be readable by assistive means, because I've actually encountered documents that I could not read or I could not fully access because of issues on my end with assistive technology. And in saying that and universalizing that concept, It also would be a really big benefit to review print-based materials to see what could be made more visual and universally accepting for those of the neurodivergent community as well, that are not all, but maybe a decent portion are very forward visual thinkers.
Okay, any other reflections before we move on to the next question? I think we can probably also incorporate some of additional thinking that we think about into responses for the next questions too. So I'll go to the third question. What are some accessibility challenges in the healthcare system? And how might that impact health system learning? How can we minimize the impact of those challenges to improve access and continued learning? And I'll ask that in another way. In other words, what does accessibility and systemic ableism look like in terms of health in the healthcare system? And do you have any practical examples of that? And Maggie, I'll start with you. Oh, Maggie, I think you're on mute.
Actually, Zoom wasn't letting me remove mute. That was interesting. A recent practical example in my own lived experience has been encountering what navigating the use of power of attorneys in the healthcare system in conjunction with the person who needs the power of attorney having a disability and underlying health issues. My mom lost the ability to communicate sense of pain and actually had a clause written into her power of attorney that we could help her identify that when she was in pain. We were never listened to. We were never taken into account, although we would keep coming back to this notarized section of the power of attorney. That allowed us to directly to help her. So in the wake of her passing 3 months ago, I remain haunted by the fact that we all knew she was in pain and nobody listened. And I think the giving respect to healthcare in all matters for disability right down to the final days is very, very important to create that equal sense of respect, or something that she certainly didn't get. And that's a recent example I have to give because it's a very personal matter for me at this point. In addition to that, I found that, again, there's a lot of policy, and in the wake of COVID, particularly at the local hospital here, navigating policy and having the on-call weekend person understand how to navigate policy is much like trying to lead a herd of cats through a maze in 4 different directions. It was just like, it's here, it's in print, but nobody could communicate to anyone else. And I'm thinking, if that's happening here, it's happening in other places. So, because it's not just a one-off situation, typically. And when you think of statistically speaking, and so I wonder how that could actually become a blanket systemic positive change for how health policy is negated across the country. I guess answering a question with another question in a long sense, but.
Thanks, Maggie. And I wanted to mention my sincere condolences for the passing of your mom. And Miriam or Trudy on this question, or following up from Maggie. So accessibility challenges in the healthcare system itself, and impact on health system learning, and maybe reflecting on that. Sorry, Trudy, go ahead.
Well, I too would like to express my condolences, Maggie. And but I agree with what Maggie said. It's like gatekeeping. It's that there are people in power, and that's an unfortunate thing, and that they decide what's right and what's wrong when they're dealing with people with disabilities, especially, and it's gatekeeping. And I think that's something that really needs to be looked at. What entitles them to be the gatekeepers? I am disabled. I'm not able to work. It's an invisible disability, but my doctor will not fill out the forms for me to get the disability tax credit with CRA, because she says I don't look disabled, therefore I don't qualify. But she made that decision. CRA didn't make that decision. So she is the gatekeeper. She diagnosed me. She's the one that signed the paperwork that I couldn't work anymore. But yet she doesn't see that as enough of a disability to sign the paperwork for CRA. Other people who have my conditions, some of them get the CRA tax credit, some of them don't. And once again, it's the same thing. They have doctors who think they're gatekeepers and that they get to decide whether a person can even apply for that sort of thing. And that's a real challenge in the healthcare system. If you go into the emergency department and you look okay, then I know how busy they are. I am a medically retired nurse. I know how busy the emergency department is, but they often, people who don't look sick or have some type of invisible disability often get sent away. And they can be sent away and terrible things happen to them, or they just decide, I will never go to the emergency department again. So that's not a good thing either, because you can then not go when you need to go for something that's physically wrong with you, all because of how you were treated when you went and you didn't look sick. So I think gatekeeping is a huge part and a huge challenge in the healthcare system.
Thanks, Trudy. Miriam, your reflections?
Yeah, just to Maggie, also my condolences. Yeah, I think that's really important actually, because so both on the point of power of attorney and what Trudy just said, I think that so I myself personally with CF, I'm nearing in a little while the process of lung transplantation, and so I'm starting to really have to understand more around dignity in death and what does that mean? What does that mean for some of the red flags I've already seen just with my own transplant doctor? I had added on like a CBC article that actually came out pre-COVID about this issue of a lot of folks with pulmonary conditions that were choosing palliative care because they couldn't afford to live in Toronto for these very life-saving procedures. And then we had COVID, and then we had a housing crisis on top of that. So now people are definitely not able to go to be able to move forward with a new set of lungs. And so that's an issue of how do we, in being told you need a lung transplant, but also try to find the money to go. That's a very heavy conversation, and that's very difficult to navigate when you're already in that position. And I think with what Trudy mentioned too, I think that, yeah, there's a huge amount of gatekeeping on DTC, RDSP stuff and things like that. And I think that doctors, like clinicians, need to realize just how much that impacts your livelihood. By not allowing the signing of those documentations, you inevitably, because there is finances and other benefits attached to that, and if you're off work, I mean, you're setting them all up for a huge amount of economic stress, and that will compound then on top of people's conditions, right? And so that's a huge, huge problem that I'm seeing myself. And it's the way that so I just took part in a thing for a CF project where I actually was helping someone navigate how to try to get access to this, because again, when CRA lists all of the conditions that qualify for the DTC benefit, And some of them are not physically, viewable disabilities. And on there is LD, like learning disabilities are on there. There's ADHDs on there. There's so many different things that are on the CRA's list. So the government already has a set criteria of here's who can qualify. And then you run into the doctors and you're kind of like, okay, but you're not listening to even what the government is saying, let alone what I'm saying as a patient. So it's very difficult. It's very difficult and it's exhausting. And I think that even just having offered information last week to someone about this and letting them know, like, even just navigating the RDSP, for example, I found out recently that that would also probably down the road hinder my CPP benefits down the road. So that means later when you have worked for so many years, you're allowed to access disability benefits through that, and that may be impacted because now you have an RDSP. So you might not even get those benefits, right? Because you already have something in place. But at the end of the day, lung transplantation, from what I'm seeing from a lot of folks who are going through it now, hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, GoFundMe's all over the place trying to get the money to go. And the money that the government even offers, you have to dig around and realize that there's other things attached to those RDSPs that can trigger grants and bonds, and no one tells us these things, right? No one at the bank even sat down with me and was like, oh, by the way, did you know that there's other things attached to this account? No, I didn't. I'm 10 years behind now and I have to figure out how to get the money, right? So yeah, it's personal, it's exhausting, it's political, and that's why I think there needs to be something that people, again, just echoing Trudy and Maggie too, like these universal concepts of, hello, like we need to make this work for all of us so that we can all be here and be happy and healthy. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Miriam. And RDSP, Registered Disability Savings Plan? Okay, thanks. This underscores the importance of accessibility standards, by which the different parts of the system, education, employment, healthcare, the standards by which they enact policies, and standards make things more consistent. And with 4 of our provinces, Nova Scotia, Manitoba, Ontario, and most recently BC has explicitly listed accessibility in healthcare as a priority area. It's more or less implied in the other accessibility legislations in the different provinces, but BC has made it very explicit. So for the last question, we have about 6 minutes. So for the last question, how can we ensure meaningful, equitable, and inclusive patient engagement with disabled, MAD, deaf, hard of hearing, and neurodiverse people in the healthcare system? So put another way, how can we support disabled, MAD, deaf, and hard of hearing and neurodiverse people to take ownership and control over the collection of their health data and the interpretation and use of such data? So I'll start with Maggie.
Thank you. I really think that the individuals who experience an intersection related to disability, MAD, deaf, and hard of hearing, and neurodiverse, all really need to understand what their each own unique healthcare rights to access are, what they can, how navigation needs to look, could look, or should look for them. At the same time, I feel like the medical system, everyone in the medical system, I feel like there's unique little training efforts that happen here and there sporadically, depending on department of the hospital and so on. But doctors in particular really need to have across the board knowledge of, educational training around just train away the stigma. What you see is you're looking at a person, you're not looking at a label. yes, you've provided a label based on a few hundred years of medical arts training and efforts that have come into your training up to that date, but you need to see the social component of the individual, and that goes for nurses and specialists, admin staff, lab techs, and so on. It needs to be a system-wide approach, and it needs to be delivered in such a way that it doesn't feel like, as most, not all, but a portion of abled individuals feel like they're being attacked when they're being given training and support in how to understand disability, and it has to be delivered in a non-threatening manner. And yeah, that's the biggest thought that I really have around. And it's not just understanding the day-to-day of disability, it's also understanding policy and negating. Doctors have to understand this, the paperwork for the federal government and what that means and what's accepted as a disability and what's not accepted as a disability, because I temporarily had a disability tax credit and now I have a lifelong indefinite disability tax credit, and I have no idea how that occurred because I just looked on my CRA one day and suddenly it was there. No idea. And so I think that there's just a lot more communication holes that keep needing to be filled, and public education and training in these specific professions would be a great way of getting there.
Thanks, Maggie. Trudy or Miriam?
I will, I agree with Maggie, and I also, when I was talking about not being able to get the CRA tax credit, the interesting thing was I qualified for LTD, so that's not an easy thing to do. So, but for a long time, and it was never questioned, it continued, but yet, you know, so it's kind of like, you know, you can't be half, you're either pregnant or you're not, you know, you either have COVID or you don't, you're either disabled or you're not. So if I was disabled enough for the LTD, I don't know where the or not fits in, right? So, and with Maggie said that education, really, one of the big things the healthcare system has to realize is that they are ableist, that they do practice ableism. And I think that if you talk to them individually, they would be probably highly put out that you would think they did. But I don't think they realize that how easy that is to be or ableist. It's and I think I agree with Maggie, they would be insulted, they would be taken back, but it's sort of like accepting the fact that we have practiced colonialism in Canada for a long time, and that we need to take ownership of that, and we need to, you know, change that the same way that ableism has been practiced for a long time, and we need to have people really look at that and look at their healthcare practices and look at their offices and say, what do we do here that makes us practice ableism, and how can we stop doing that? And I do think that not just disabled people, but I think everyone should have control of their health data and the interpretation and use of that data. But it's especially important for the disabled community, because how you're treated can be based on what's in that health data. You know, it's I think we should be aware of what our doctors are writing about us, or what when you go into the emergency department, how they're classifying you. I think that's very important for everyone to know that, but it's particularly important for the disabled community.
Thanks, Trudy. There was a study with COVID, just really briefly, in terms of data and charts and what was added to people's charts, and people in long-term care. The study was in the UK. Automatically with COVID, they had added the DNR, do not resuscitate, orders in the charts of all people in long-term care. So policy has a very direct connection to individual people's health and the decisions made about them. Miriam, your thoughts on just sorry, what how to have equitable and inclusive patient engagement and self-determination.
Yeah, I just no, Trudy already described it, and so did Maggie. That just I think the overarching issue is to address gatekeeping. I think the need for intersectionality, and I think on all levels of experience, and I think that there's a huge potential for disability justice to also really make a bit of a change, I think. And just the ongoing need for learning and knowledge spreading, I think that's so critical.
Thanks, Miriam. So it's now 2:03, and this will close the panel discussion portion, but we're opening the Q&A now. And Prince will take over moderating the Q&A. And this will be for about 20 minutes or so, and then I'll give some closing remarks. And also to note that well, maybe Prince will say so, but I'm also, if anyone might have questions for me, I might give some, or I might, if I see I can offer some of my knowledge, then I'll offer that during the session too.
Hi, thanks, Lucy, and thanks to all the panelists. This has been very, very insightful. I really enjoyed our discussion about, personally, I really appreciate the anecdotal comments and statements about how we actually really interact with the healthcare system, and also reflections on our connections with MSSU and how MSSU can possibly improve in the way it goes about ensuring accessibility and tries to move away from systemic ableism. I think that the assumptions are usually very deeply rooted, so it's an ongoing process of learning. So thank you so much about for all your insightful remarks about the questions that were asked. And I would open it up for engagement at this point. We have a Q&A spot as well as the chat as well. I'm monitoring both, and so if you have any question, you can go ahead and share that, and I'll read it out to our panelists for comments or a response. As you prepare to send out your questions, maybe I can begin with a question. And I've been pondering and thinking about this for a while. All attempts at ensuring accessibility and systemic ableism sometimes meet some form of resistance from people who are ableist, and some, as we have reflected on, we take for granted even the ways in which we are ableist. So how can we, or if there are any examples where you have actually experienced or encountered people resisting the kind of change you are advocating for in your own practice, or if you have encountered any form of resistance to a service that you wanted. I know we've touched on a bit of on that, but I'd like you to explore or explain that a bit more, that part of resistance, because I've had different engagements with people who I identify as disabled, and one of the main things they talk about is that there are sometimes some forms of resistance to their engagement, especially when they are advocating for the removal of barriers. So I'm wondering, in your own personal experiences, have you encountered any barriers that to the work or to what you have been advocating for? Maybe Mariam, you can give it a shot.
Sure. Learning disability. Maybe, I guess, let's just say a long time ago. I'm not actually that old. But so when I was entering, so I was homeschooled actually for a long time. So there's always this weird narrative of also homeschooling and what that means when you want to actually then go into public schooling, and that apparently that's this whole other debate. But because I was a medical immigrant due to my cystic fibrosis, I wasn't actually able to access certain medical care right away. And so I immigrated when I was age 4. And for a few years, I actually had to be homeschooled because things were not getting set up quickly enough with public schooling. And I just remember when I finally got to public school, just how serious I took it, because I just remember a lot of folks that just were like, school, whatever. And for me, it was a big privilege because first, I was told that with CF, you may not live long anyway. So you're already kind of like, let me, do what I can now in general. But then as I moved through the system of all through up until graduate work, and then when I was finally diagnosed with an LD, which weirdly enough, the strictness of my German upbringing, actually, with the strictness of my regimen I'd have to follow for my CF care, also impacted how I did my LD and how I actually managed and navigated my LD in a more structured system, which really helped me overcome a lot of barriers, I think, to having a learning disability. And so when I finally got to graduate work, there's still people now that were harassing me and putting me down and saying like, oh, well, like you're too LD and you'll never get to college, you'll never go on for whatever. They're the same people in the same breath now who go like, oh, I wasn't even get there. And I found that really insulting, actually, because to me, I stayed committed and I stayed on the track that I wanted to go on to get to where I needed to get to academically. And I think that when you start that process of telling someone like you're not good enough for something, yeah, a lot of folks, we decide we're going to work harder, or we decide to not do it at all and just do something completely different. But for me, I think it goes to show also the struggle of having an LD, and also this idea of having as an immigrant to mimic the system you're in to survive. That has to go for language, like learning English, and what does housing policy mean, and what does the legal concepts mean, and there's a whole other level there that I've actually learned a great deal from my international friends here, even as students, that were like, hey, there's a lot of landlords that take advantage of international folks. There's a lot of legal problems that do the same thing. And I think that's the issue, is that they assume certain things about certain people, and then that's where people have backlash, where it's like, no, I like that, and how dare you do that to me? So for me, that's only one aspect. I mean, there's so many others, but I guess for my LD, I guess it's a really big one, because I very quietly now engage with those people that used to put me down and say, like, you'll never get to this point. And when you finally say you're doing this and this, it's kind of just like, okay, but it's hard. I think people need to be careful of how they engage with folks and what their dreams are and where they want to go. I think no one has a right to whatsoever dictate that to people, honestly.
Thanks a lot, Miriam. It's so insightful, and as you always have reflected on throughout our conversation, we always have to pay attention to intersectionality and the multiple axes of experiences and identities that people bring, and how that might impact one single issue. And you rightly said also that we never live single issue lives. It's very complex and multivariate. Lucy,
I've raised my hand for sake of, but if someone else would like to go first. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Prince. Resistance. I'll give an example of my own lived experience in terms of employment, and I'll reflect on that a little bit. Well, that and also what we teach. So we teach folks to self-advocate and to amass all these tools to advocate for oneself in terms of advocating for one's rights. And so thinking, yep, I got all the tools, and I'm going to ask for the thing, and I'm going to ask for accommodations, and then being met with responses that blame the system itself. So, well, first of all, not having a policy for accommodation, let alone accessibility. So that not all workplaces will have actually even an accommodations policy. So there's that. So not having a clear set of steps that this follows, or an agreed upon set of steps, let alone knowing whether people with disabilities were involved in making those steps. So there's that. Also, when I was saying blaming the system, it's as though folks feel that they can't make any difference because the policy says, X, Y, and Z, and therefore, it's kind of my hands are tied. I can't really accommodate you, or I can't really, it could be in terms of employment, for example, it could be, oh no, the union might oppose this, or, there are lots of fingers pointing outward. But what folks don't realize is that really the question has been posed to them. And so they have an opportunity to think, okay, how might we get this done? Taking the word of the person with a disability at face value, this is their lived experience. They are sharing with you, oftentimes bravely, because of ableism, sharing with you their need. And also it's just law. Let's just say it's just law as well. Folks have a right to this. And yeah, so being in the position of, if you're in a position where an issue is brought to your attention, questioning how might I facilitate this? What do I need to get this going? If I anticipate opposition, well, how might I get buy-in? How might I facilitate this particular accessibility here? That's an expertise that each person has at that nexus, right? They know what those pressure points are. Fantastic. Then they can not, as opposed to citing how the system hasn't defined things enough yet, they're in a position that they can help define that. They can help ask, they can help, identify the different players, the different policies, and, how might I actually make this more accessible? So I think individuals, sometimes we talk about systemic ableism, it's like it's somewhere out there, but the system's us. It's us. We're shepherds, right? We don't want to be gatekeepers. We don't want to use the system and say, no, sorry, it's not possible. We want to ask, how might we? And shepherd this accessibility, improvements in accessibility, particularly if we have someone presenting that valuable information in terms of, oh, no, this is an inaccessible spot. Well, take advantage of that. And not sorry, and just one more thing about the ableism, not feeling that, uh-oh, I'm being called ableist. I'm not ableist. It's not about that. It really is about engagement, conversation, and asking, how might we? This isn't about labeling people per se.
Thanks a lot, Lucy. I like how you reflected on the system being part of the system and being gatekeepers, and that question of how might we is something that resonates a lot. So Katie, I saw your hands up before Trudy.
Great. Thank you very much, Prince. And thanks to everyone for such an incredible panel, for the discussion, for the vulnerability and the strength through sharing your stories that you've all shown. It takes incredible courage to speak one's experience, because within the current context, speaking one's experience of disability is speaking truth to power. It's so stigmatized and hidden and segregated and framed using such a deficit model, particularly in health. We have a special responsibility in health to address the ways that medical knowledge or clinical understandings can be used to devalue the knowledge, the lives, the realities, the complexities, and the experiences of people who may not resemble some constructed statistical norms. So I want to take a moment to thank you. So I have a question, and then I have a few key points for the transcript of things I've heard. And I know Lucy has a wrap up happening, but I think it's so interesting to think about accommodation policies co-created with persons with disabilities and people living with difference within the context of MSSU work. So accommodation policies within patient partner initiatives, accommodation policies that researchers may include in their grant applications, accommodation policies within human resources more broadly. We tend to rely on institutions within our work, like the university or college or health institution hospitals, for guidance, but perhaps part of, in living an accessibility agenda involves taking the lead in terms of developing policies that can inspire or catalyze changes within broader institutional settings. I also thought it was so important how everyone clarified the significance of benefits. And do we understand what disability benefits are there? So when I say benefits, I mean those financial programs or other programs and services that support people in being able to fully experience social and community life. And so what do we need to learn as people who are in privileged positions as researchers and capacitators, professionals and practitioners whose role is to capacitate the health research landscape? Epistemic justice is a very rarefied term, and rarefied is a rarefied term, technical term, a term not widely used, but epistemic means knowledge. So whose knowledge is treated as real? And at what point does not accepting what someone say kind of form a kind of injustice? And there's a whole body of knowledge in anti-colonial, post-colonial work. So you raised that, Miriam, around epistemic justice, that racialized and colonized people have faced not having your knowledge appreciated as true. And having knowledge of another worldview imposed onto you. What does that look like for us? How can we check where we are at with unconscious bias and ableism in a way where we can, it's strengths-based. We're working towards identifying conflicts to resolve them or be animated by those tensions. And what are the implications of the way research is framed? Thinking about what Trudy said about language. When we frame the research around burden, disability burden, things like that, what does that do to how publics and practitioners perceive people with disabilities? And how do we really just, what I thought was so beautiful and brilliant was the need to prevent and remove barriers, to be allies and champions in all of the work that we do. So my question is here. What are your big ideas? Any other big ideas for practical technical, like there's, what are some things, other things that we might be able to do within the MSSU to address these very serious and significant systemic issues that you've raised? Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. Maybe we'll take a response and then we'll hand over to Trudy. I know you also had a question before Lucy wraps up. I think Katie's question is very interesting. I also had a similar question because we always like to give you an opportunity, sort of like a magic wand. If you were in the position of power, what do you think? What's the big idea? What do you think can create the change that we need when we are talking about systemic ableism and accessibility? So what are the big ideas? Lucy?
My big idea, which I feel is a simple idea, but seems to be so difficult. And if I had a magic wand, I would focus on building capacity to see, to hear, to understand a multiplicity of narratives. So not the power holder decides what narrative is real. The power holder or the leader governs in a way, or we could talk about different leadership models. That's not my point. But my point is to have the capacity to understand that there are actually multiple narratives and worldviews happening, obviously, at the same time, and to have the capacity to hold those. So in any context we have, in meetings, in our classrooms, in our research, when we're as healthcare practitioners, knowing it's not a competition of my view versus your view, but that your view exists and so does mine. And I bring something to the table on this topic with my view, as does someone else. And I'm not talking also, everyone gets to have an opinion. So people without disabilities get to speak the opinion on behalf of people with disabilities. That's not what I'm talking either. The people with the expertise in that particular area. And the expertise being, I really love that term, epistemic justice. The people with the knowledge for that knowledge to be held on par. There's research knowledge, there's indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledges, there's knowledge based in lived experience, right? And to have those as equal and considering them all. It's not actually as complicated. What's worse and what is depleting is the constant struggle for power over controlling the narrative. That is debilitating. And that takes a huge learning curve too, which wastes a lot of time. So if we could build the capacity, magic wand, we all have the capacity to especially the folks, who are controlling things, who have power to hold those multiple narratives and to govern that way. That would be my big, simple idea, biggest wish.
Thanks, Lucy. Trudy, did you have a question? I have one question from our Q&A chat here. So maybe after you, Trudy.
I had a comment, actually. I just wanted to comment on what Miriam had said earlier. And I really like Lucy's idea of the big idea. I agree with that. That's very well said, actually. And but Miriam, I just wanted to comment on the fact that my daughter, when she was 8 years old, she was diagnosed with fibromyalgia and ME and life-threatening asthma, and had to be homeschooled. She had multi-chemical sensitivities as well. So it was difficult for her. And she also had that, you're never going to amount to anything. And I had the pressure of, you shouldn't be doing this to her, instead of, you know, but there were days I couldn't even get her awake off the couch. And so fortunately for her, she did recover and is in what I would term as a remission from her DME, but she still continues with the asthma and fibromyalgia. And she went to university. She went to Dalhousie. She's an engineer, an electrical engineer, as a matter of fact. So all there, you're never going to amount to anything. And she has a very good job, but she hides her disability. She doesn't talk about it. And when, Lucy, you were talking about accommodations, it's like when she looks at trying to get an accommodation, when she goes into a flare, the act of getting those accommodations is so difficult that she just gets a doctor's note saying that she's off sick presently, and she stays off until she's able to go back to work without accommodations. And that sometimes is a very long period of time. She's been off up to 3-4 months at a time. So, but that's the thing, that it's hiding. When you have to hide your disability because you don't want to be treated differently, because you don't want it to affect your career path, that's pretty sad, actually. And when I was thinking about listening to Miriam, I have only probably in the last 2 years admitted to people that I was medically retired and that I had what I would term a disability. Up until then, I just told people I retired from nursing, and I was old enough that people said, well, lucky you. You know, but it's when you have to hide your disability, or you feel you have to hide your disability, that's a sad reflection on ableism, actually. So that's all I have to say. Thank you, Prince.
Okay. Thanks, Trudy. So perhaps I'll read a question and then we'll have a response, and maybe Lucy can, in the interest of time, also maybe just one response, and then Lucy can wrap up. The question reads, do you think it is important for MSSU to combat systemic ableism by hiring people living with disabilities rather than only having them as patient partners, like walking the walk in a way? So that's the question. Do you think it is important for MSSU to combat systemic ableism by hiring people living with disabilities rather than only having them as patient partners, like walking the walk in a way?
Can I speak to that? And my answer will be very quick. Oh my goodness, yes.
Thanks, Trudy.
I think that's a perfect answer. So yes, thanks. We have a minute to our scheduled time. I think actually Katie offered such wonderful reflections. The only thing that I would add is an encouragement to everyone to think about ableism, systemic ableism, and accessibility in your individual role. There are gaps. I'm just going to guarantee you there are many gaps for each and every one of us in our roles, many gaps to accessibility. So think about your role and what might be, you know, perhaps someone has raised an issue. Perhaps they haven't. Perhaps have a look at, you know, different accessibility, you know, literature options of you know, the website for the accessibility standards that are coming in your particular province. In Nova Scotia, for example, they're coming. To think about, you know, how can I make this particular my particular job, my particular what's in my job description more accessible, and who can I talk to make that happen? What conversations need to happen? I'd love for folks to be conversing about accessibility after this. And really, really quick, just want to thank everyone. Thank panelists. Thank you to the MSSU EDI team, and to the team lead, Katie Aubrecht. Thank you for inviting me to chair today. It's been an immense pleasure and privilege. I've enjoyed it a lot. Thanks to our interpreters, Hannah and Brenda. And thanks to MSSU staff for participating in the webinar. We thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Lucy. We couldn't end without a thank you to you. So maybe we'll do a round of applause. I always do this teaching. We'll hear and feel each other.